Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld. Welcome to Back to the Bible Canada. Delighted to have you join me today. I am doing a series on the providence of God, and if you're unfamiliar with that, go back and watch the last two that I've done on this. But today I'm going to talk about God's rulership of the nation. But as a way of setting that up, let me tell you a little bit about my personal family history. My parents grew up in small German villages in what was then called the USSR, or as we often know it as the Soviet Union. But today it would be known as Ukraine, the nation of Ukraine. Yeah. And what was the childhood of my parents like? Well, it wasn't a pleasant childhood. It was a terrifying childhood. People were being dragged into prison. You never knew when the communist official would come into the village, whom he would point at, and that person would never be seen again. What's interesting as well is prior to the communist reign, they were doing quite well, these German villages. They had their own, they built their own churches, they had an open expression of their faith without any concern whatsoever, and they became prosperous, and that's where the problem lay. They were called kulaks, and you can look that up. What was a kulak? They weren't bourgeoisie. They were, in fact, peasants, but they were prosperous peasants. And because prosperous peasants tended to think about, the free market economy and how they could make their own farms prosper more, they were seen as a real problem for the communists, and the communists targeted them as enemies of the state. And so because of all of these things, Stalin began a forcible starvation of Ukraine. And so all of these people who lived on this rich farmland that provided them with prosperity now lived on that same farmland in which the government would constantly come and take not some of your food away, but all of your food away and leave you with nothing. My uncle died of malnutrition during those years. My grandfather was taken away. He was one of the people that was pointed at as a counter-revolutionary. He was put in prison and he was murdered there. My father lived with this great sense of fear. When I grew up, my mom and dad used to tell the stories of communist spies that would be looking into windows to see whether or not, a family was praying together. That was considered counter-revolutionary, and so forth. So those are the stories I grew up with. And I mention that only now because we're talking about the providence of God. And I want to talk about how God rules the nation. And so up till now, what I've dealt with is that God is providential, that he controls all of nature, and that all of nature responds to his will and his purpose, and that God is being glorified in nature. So that's been where I have been going. But, up till then, up till now, we've really been discussing the easier topics. And now we're going to start with some of the more difficult ones. When we say that God rules over all things, we also mean that God rules the nations. And when I talk about God ruling the nations, we need to recognize that the story of my family and the stories that I grew listening to, they're not unique to me. In fact, let's just think about the last full century that we've just experienced, which is the 20th century. So the 20th century began with the Turks, that is the nation of Turkey, committing a Holocaust against Armenian Christians. And I've been told that you can go and do some, pilgrimage tours through Turkey in which the guides will openly tell you that, Christianity has been seen to be an inferior religion. Because look, Turkey used to be full of Christians and now there are none. Well, yeah, that's true because the Turks actually committed a Holocaust against Armenian Christians. They put to death over 2 million of them. And to this day, the Turkish government denies that anything of that nature ever occurred, simply denies that any of these Christians ever existed. Well, that's not the only story. While my parents were suffering, in these little villages that they were in, Stalin was busy. He was executing many. The Gulag camps, the deportation, resulted in some 20 million deaths, in the former Soviet Union. Hitler was at that point, as we all know, in the process of killing 6 million Jews. Mao in China would end the lives of some 45 million people in what he would call, listen to this, what he would call the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward. You think about that kind of a wording in the face of such brutality and evil. A great leap forward. Today we live at a time when, the Korean regime continues to put people into mass concentration camps. We are seeing war now, which is in all the news, at least at the time of this recording, of the war in Ukraine and of all the brutality that's being done there. And I want to say that over the 20th century and really over the history of the human race, it is staggering the amount of evil that has been done by governments. So to say that God rules the nation is to say something. And there are those that say, that's a proposition I just can't accept. I know that, we're so glad that we live, in a nation where we see peace and prosperity, and we have for a great many years, but we need to recognize that this is also an interesting time in the world. So to proclaim as Christ the ruler of the nations, we have some explaining to do. Maybe you agree with me on that. I'm sure you do when you think about it. So where do we begin with all of this? Now in the West, we know that we have been governed for some time by democracies, and we have been living, in a time of peace where we've also have charters of human rights, and yet we complain. Now, that's not bad. We should be complaining because we know that unless we are constantly concerned and unless there's vigilance, we will see our rights eroded, and it doesn't take that much to move from the erosion of our rights to the kind of brutality that has happened all over the world. Could it happen here? Oh, yes, it could. But however, we're talking about God ruling the world and ruling the nations, so where do we begin? Well, Romans 13 verse 1 says, there is no authority, that is no political governmental authority, except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. And I know that's something to take in. And we might have to ask ourselves, what do we make of that, especially in light of what I've just been talking about? And so we have some thinking to do. But so where do we begin here? And we begin with Psalm 22, verses 27 to 28. And here we read, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and the families of the nation shall worship before you. So that's something that's yet going to happen in the future. So this is a prophecy of what's going to happen. And then here's the next line, verse 28. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations of the earth. So when it says that kingship belongs to the Lord, now kingship, in the day in which that was written, that all of the nations were governed by a monarch, by a king. And kingship, that is, who is king, that belongs to the governance of God. So we might put it in contemporary terms today to say all government belongs to the Lord. Now we've been saying that providence, the doctrine of providence, means that God rules over everything, and we're saying that he does it to his glory, and therefore God rules over what kind of government and who is in government and who the rulers are. He rules over all of that. But then we ask, so how does that actually function? Because if God is good and he's loving and he's all powerful, which he is, clearly we have some work to do in understanding how God governs and the purposes that he has in governing. So where do we begin again? So let me start with Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. And before I read that text, let me give you a little bit of a history on the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is written at the end of Moses' life. The Exodus has happened. Israel is now in what's called the plains of Moab. They're overlooking the promised land. They're about ready to enter. Moses won't be going, but he has a series of sermons that he delivers, that's the book of Deuteronomy, to the people of Israel. There are things that he wants them to remember and must never forget. So this is his final word, the words of a dying man who is concerned for the people of God. So we come to Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, and here's what we read. Moses says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, there's a lot to be said there, but we can imagine Israel as a nation. They're about to go into the promised land. God is about to give them their land, but Moses wants also them to understand that God gave the various nations their land. He fixed borders for them. So we have to imagine Israel seeing that, that the nations that would surround them, those were nations that God had also given their borders to. And he says he does so according to the number of the sons of God. That means that God would play a vital role in who the nations of Israel would be and what their population would be. And that's interesting, because if you know anything about the First Testament, you're going to know that several things happened according to Israel's neighbors. Number one, they fought a great many bloody wars with those neighbors who didn't want them to exist. And it's no different really than today for Israel. But you want to think about that. So, you can think that Egypt is to Israel's south. They had a great deal of difficulty, Israel did, dislodging, the Philistines who were on their western side. And then at the same time, to the north, they had a great deal of problems as well with the Syrians. And to their east, they had a problem with a number of nations, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and nations like that. So all of these constituted wars. But there's more than that. These nations had their own gods and goddesses, and they were nations filled with idolatry, and they were nations filled with very evil practices. And God determined that those nations should be there at that point in time. That's what the text tells us. That's what Moses is teaching the people. God has purposely surrounded you with these nations. So in the time of war, what would they remember? They would say, well, it was God's purpose to put these nations here that are opposing us. So what do we make of that? Well, the nations that surrounded Israel would present Israel with a choice. The choice is, shall we adopt their idols and become like them? The choice is, shall we trust in God when these nations are attacking us, or shall we cry out in anger against God? See, all of these were put around them in a way to test them. So let's carry on. So we move beyond the book of Deuteronomy. We get to the book of Joshua, in which Israel inherits the promised land. Then we move beyond that to the book of Judges. And if you don't know the book of Judges is interesting because it presents us with a cycle that happens. So the cycle goes like this. Israel is, in some senses, protected, but they become complacent. They adopt the idolatrous ways of the cultures around them. They turn their back on God. They go their own way. The next phase of the cycle is that God sends enemies against them who inflict much damage on Israel. Much harm is happening. In their desperation, the third item on this cycle is that Israel cries out to God, repents of their sins, and says, God, have mercy on us. Then comes the fourth stage of the cycle where God sends a judge or a deliverer who rescues them from the hands of their enemies. And then comes the first stage of the cycle again, in which Israel abandons the Lord, forgets about God, takes everything for granted, and again adopts the ways of the idolatrous nations. It just keeps going in cycles just like that. So getting that as an example of what happens during the book of Judges, the faithlessness that's there in Israel, I come to Judges chapter 2, verses 20 to 23. And here's what it reads. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, that is, by those nations, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly. So we see that, God was actually allowing this very difficult and tragic set of circumstances to go on so that he could really come to terms with Israel's spirituality and with her lack of commitment to the one true God. Now, from those texts like that, we come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is well stated for us in Psalm 46, verses 8 to 10. And here's what it says: "Come behold the works of the Lord, how he brought desolation on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." Now, you're going to say, from that, let's come to a conclusion. When nations rise, they rise because God has directed them to do so. When nations fall and come to an end, they cease to exist because God has taken away his hand and allowed them to fall. At God's specific command, nations win battles and enlarge their territory. And at his commands, they lose battles and see their territory eroded, eventually falling into ruin. God commands that it should happen. God fulfills his purposes in this. We saw that already, both in Deuteronomy and in the book of Judges. God fulfills his purposes so that in the end of the day, he will be exalted in the earth. Job 12, verse 23 says it this way: "He makes nations great, and he destroys them. He enlarges nations, and he leads them away." Or you think about what the Apostle Paul said in the New Testament. He comes to the city of Athens, filled with philosophers. They're thinking about these, big thoughts all the time. And in Acts chapter 17, verse 26, here's what Paul says to them: "And he," that is God, "made from one man every nation of mankind to live in all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place." So God determines the time period in which every nation will exist. He determines how long that nation will exist. He determines the exact boundaries. He even determines their population. He determines their strength. He determines their weaknesses. All of these are governed by the rulership of God. And Paul goes on to say he does this so that they might, grope or feel their way through to God. God has a purpose in doing that. That's what Paul is saying. Now, I'm going to come back to that conclusion in just a little while. But before I do, I want to make a point about how God arranges the nations. It's important to know that when God arranges the nations, he both plays the short game and he plays the long game, and he plays the long game very well. I remember a number of years ago, I was in Romania shortly after the revolution. The dictator Ceausescu had just been removed from power, and communism was crumbling, and the church was being revived, and people were calling upon the Lord where they hadn't for so many years. But I was taken to a great square in the city of Timișoara where the revolution had actually begun. And I saw the bullet holes that had still been shot by the military that had come into that square to stop people. They basically had come into the square to sing hymns to God. And the army opened up fire, and they killed hundreds and hundreds of people, even little children. In fact, they even killed a children's choir. It's tragic to see what happens, but it was out of that tragedy that eventually the army said, what are we actually doing? We're killing our brothers and sisters. We're killing our own countrymen. And some of these, people that were called upon to do the killing were, in the early 20s. Some of them, were over the gun turrets and began to weep openly. And when the military leaders saw what was going on, they said, enough of this. And they took out the communist dictator Ceausescu, and they actually killed him. And it ended communism, and it brought many people to faith in Christ. That is, this horrible tragedy was so that Christ could be exalted in the nation. So, you want to think about that. We look at things from the short term and we see, bloody massacres and we see hopeless situations. We can't imagine how it could turn out well. But that's the whole point of all of that. See, I began by saying this. No government or nation can come into being unless God has willed it to be so. I've also acknowledged that there is a certain mystery in all of this. See, on the one hand, God allows nations to rebel, go their own way, and even do evil. But God also strictly controls the limits of their power, and He plans their rise and their fall. So what can we say with certainty? We say certainty that we begin by acknowledging that God controls the nations. And that's a biblical truth. Daniel chapter 2. We need to read Daniel chapter 2 against the background of the Babylonian captivity who have destroyed Israel. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has been responsible for destroying Israel and creating much power, much tragedy. He's also burned the temple to the ground. And in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, this is what Daniel says. He changes times and seasons. God removes kings and He sets up kings. So in other words, he's saying, look, God set up Nebuchadnezzar. And the Bible's even more specific than that. It even goes further and says that there's a purpose in all of this. And in this regard, I'm going to take us to Isaiah chapter 37. It's a very important text in our Bible. Isaiah 37 has a historic background to it. Israel is being surrounded at that time by the Assyrian army. And it looks very, very bad. King Hezekiah, the righteous king, is falling before God in the temple, pleading with God. Isaiah the prophet comes to encourage the king, and he also wants to tell the king something about this man named Sennacherib who would destroy Israel. I'm reading Isaiah 37, verses 26 and 27, and the prophet speaks directly to the king of Assyria. He says, "Have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you, the king of Assyria, should make fortified cities crash into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded, and have become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it was fully grown." Now, are you surprised by that? That the expansion of this cruel Assyrian kingdom, God says very directly, I take responsibility for it. Not apologizing for this, I take responsibility. Now, in terms of Assyria, remember I said God plays the long game. In terms of Assyria, well, I can say this, that eventually what it led to would be the Babylonian captivity later on. I won't go through all the details, but I'll say this. Eventually what it led to was the coming of the Messiah and the plan of salvation for the whole earth. There's a whole series of events that God worked carefully to plan so that the maximum amount of people would hear about God's saving activity. And this would happen even against a background of some very dark events that happens. See, here's what I'm going to say. God arranges the cultures of the earth for the good of the people of God and also for the good of the church. Yeah, for the good of the church today. Are you unconvinced by that? Let me read to you Ephesians 1:22. "And he, that is God the Father, put all things under his, that is God the Son's feet, and gave him as head over everything, all things, to the church," or for the benefit of the church. Christ was raised from the dead. The Father gave the Son an authority to rule over every power, every dominion, every government, in the end for the benefit of the church. That's what we learn from Ephesians 1:22. In other words, God's doing something. He's not just letting evil happen for, evil purposes. God is not evil. But he will allow evil to have its day, and he'll bound evil in, and he'll do so and let it go only this far and no further, because he says, I have a purpose in mind. I'm building a church from every tribe and tongue and nation on earth. And I allow this upheaval to happen among the nations so that the maximum amount of people will find their way to be reconciled to God through Christ and have an eternity of joy. That's what God is up to. Now, we don't always know the details, but we know the ultimate purposes. Are you still unconvinced? Well, listen to John's words in Revelation chapter 1, verse 5. John calls Jesus the ruler of the kings of the earth. Did you get that? He rules over all the kings, over all the governments, over all the people who inhabit governmental offices at any point in time. Christ rules that. And you read through the book of Revelation, and you find that there are these 7 churches in the province of Asia. They're hard pressed. They're being persecuted. They don't know what's going to happen. They're facing this monstrous Roman government at their time. And they wonder if they can survive all of that. And we have these chapters in Revelation that tell us that. And then we come to chapter 4 of Revelation, where John hears the words come up here, and he's ushered into the throne room of God. And he sees something that's much greater than the throne room of Rome. He sees the throne room of heaven, where the ultimate power is meted out. What's John seeing? He is seeing that there is a throne that rules over all the minor thrones of this world. Do you need further proof? Pagan King Cyrus, he's king of Persia. He'd be the king that would allow, he would bless Israel. Ezra chapter 1, verse 2. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of this earth, says Cyrus, king of Persia, and has charged me to build a house at Jerusalem. So get this. In Cyrus's time, he's king of Persia. He's going to allow Israel to go back to the promised land after 70 years of captivity. He's going to let them go back there and rebuild their temple. And he says, you know why I've been put here? I'm here governor of this powerful nation at my time, and God of heaven has given me the kingdoms of this earth. So let me read something I've written. Having established that God rules the nations, that the nations often rage against God, God still in providence rules the nations, their time periods, where their borders lie, how long they exist, the exact time in which every person lives. And he gives the rulers in order to advance the gospel and grow the church. That was true in Cyrus's time. It grew the gospel. Now, what do we learn from all of that? So let me speak to those of us. Canada, we live in a democracy. It's often our tendency to speak well of, prime ministers with whom we agree, and we speak ill of those with whom we disagree, and that's fine. But let's understand this. According to Romans 13, verse 1, there is no authority except that which has been established by God. Understand that. Romans 13, verse 2 says, whoever resists the authorities resists God. Understand that. So how do we put that all together? Because, we live in a land which, in many ways has given us freedoms, but in many ways has also been corrosive to the church. I mean, you think about, what's happened in Canada, over a generation. The church has the church has been hard pressed. The church has looked at a culture that is becoming less and less open to the gospel in many ways, or some other ways, it is more open. But in some, it's been a very difficult time that we live in. We say, how can God actually allow this? And the answer is that God is allowing things to progress as he does for the maximum benefit of the church, so that Christ is glorified, so that the maximum amount of people come to know Christ as Savior and Lord. We need to do that. We need to pray this way. Oh God, I know that the government that's in place right now is your doing. I also know that no purpose of yours can be thwarted in this country. Now, I don't know how, but dear Lord, providentially guide this nation. See, think of yourself living in this nation like Babylon, and Daniel living in Babylon. Daniel sought to serve his nation as best he could, knowing that Babylon was put into place at that hour for God's specific purpose. Now, you take that to heart. You say, look, I'm living in Canada at this hour. I'm going to do everything that I can to be of maximum blessing to this nation. I mean, that might mean that I prophetically speak against some of the evil that's done in this nation, but I'm looking to make this nation as prosperous as it can. That's my job as a believer, knowing that God will yet glorify himself in this nation. So what if the gospel suffers want? Well, in that case, I've got to believe that God has even a greater purpose in mind. And that's always the thing that we need to remember, that God controls all things so that in the end, he's glorified, and that in the end, the church is benefited. Now, I can't see it always because I live in a very defined point in history. I mean, I know that my generation may live and die and not see the purpose that God has at this hour. I know it's also possible that God can allow our nation and our government to be such that will, in fact, bring a great deal of harm to this nation. That's possible. I pray it should not be that way, but God may, for his own purposes, decide that. I know, however, that in the end, it will be well for the gospel, it will be well for the glory of God, and it will multiply the amount of people that have come into the kingdom. So, God rules the nations. God rules our nation. His ways are mysterious, more than I can understand. Knowing that God rules the nation doesn't mean that there won't be suffering, and if there is, I will entrust my soul into the hands of God. But I do know this, things have not gotten out of control. They are indeed in control, because the God whom we worship is the God who rules over all things. Thank you for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada. I hope this has given you reason for hope, not discouragement, genuine hope. Remember that God plays the long game very well, and recognize also that God has called you to an eternal purpose. So because of all of those things, take hope, be of great courage, don't be dismayed. Put your hope in God. Hey, may the Lord be with you. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.